Hello, how you doing and welcome back to the channel. Well, I didn't see that coming. What a URC semi-final, Munster beating Leinster, and in this video I'm talking about why I think this is a great result for the URC as a whole. I know Leinster are going to be gutted, but I think for the competition more generally, I think this is a really positive result. So I'm going to be speaking about that. I'll look back a little bit on that game yesterday between Leinster and Munster, and then also look ahead to the final and mention the European final as well in a week's time, because that has become massive now for Leinster. So make sure you drop a comment down below on anything I touch upon in this video. Like the video as well, and make sure you're subscribed to the channel. But let's get into it. So I feel like there's so many bases I want to touch in this video, so I'm just going to try and work my way through them. But as I said in the intro, it's a great result for the URC. And I guess what I mean by that is it's a great result for the neutrals as well. But I think the danger with the URC is something that actually happens a lot in rugby. We've seen it in the Gallagher Premiership a lot over the years with Saracens' dominance. And I think the danger of the URC is something similar, where Leinster, you always fear, are just going to absolutely cakewalk their way to the title, in that we know how good they are. And I think if every team in the competition is playing as well as they possibly can, I think Leinster probably win it on most occasions. I know some of the South African sides will have a big thing to say about that, but I think that's probably, as a general statement, quite fair. But for 2 years in a row now, Leinster have come up short. And if you think about sport, think about all sport, not just rugby, uncertainty of the outcome is kind of what engages us in it, right? It's so important, not knowing what's going to happen. If we knew every time we turned up what the result's going to be, then it kind of gets a little bit boring. And in a sport like rugby, which actually I feel like at club level, particularly in the big knockout games, we don't get as many upsets as I think we'd maybe like. I think this is absolutely massive for the competition as a whole, because all of a sudden you look at it and you look at the last 2 years and we say, all right, we know Leinster are brilliant, but for 2 years in a row, they haven't been able to win the competition. Who is going to win the competition? There's uncertainty in the outcome of the URC, and for the competition as a whole, that is a really positive thing. I also think as well that I'm getting ahead of myself a little bit here, but let's say the Stormers do go on and win it, and I think most people would have them favourites with that final happening in Cape Town. That's a really positive thing as well. And I don't have skin in the game. I don't mind if Munster win, if the Stormers win. But if I'm looking at the URC and I'm looking at how does the URC, which is in its early stages still, how does it become a successful competition? Their aim will to be the best domestic rugby competition in the world. How do they do that? Well, in my opinion, the engagement of the South African rugby public in it is a really key part of that. And we're potentially looking at a scenario where 2 years in a row, since they've joined it, South African sides have won it. And I think that's just going to fuel the interest in South Africa and how fervently they support their nation. The interest, the eyeballs you can get on that competition if the South African fans are really engaged in it is a really positive thing for the competition overall. So there's a whole host of reasons there, but I do believe, and I know that Leinster are going to be gutted, they've got a chance to make amends in the Champions Cup final in a week's time, but I think for the competition it's a really good thing. The final thing I want to mention in this little part of the video is, in the current world of domestic rugby, where we see bags of tries all the time, some of the scorelines we see across the board, whether it's in the URC, whether it's in the Gallagher Premiership, you see some really high scoring games. And don't get me wrong, there is a time and a place for them. Sometimes if you go to a game on a Saturday or a Sunday and you watch a 45-40 game, you get loads of tries, it's going to be really entertaining. But there is absolutely a place still for a tight, low-scoring, high-stakes match like this. Leinster 15, Munster 16, the final scoreline. And I loved that. A real arm wrestle of a match. Semi-final, place in the final on the line. Two good teams going at it. The lead changing hands. I love that. I think there's definitely still a massive place for that in the game. And often what we see these days is just a bucket load of points, which can be fun, but I like to see the variation, I guess is the point I'm making there. Let's get on to the game itself. Now, full disclosure here, I didn't actually watch this game. I am busy this weekend keeping up with the Gallagher Premiership semi-finals. So drop some comments down below, Leinster and Munster fans, who will have a better idea of how this game played out than I have. I've watched the highlights. I've been reading up on it this morning in the press and the news articles and things like that. But Jack Crowley, the cojones on him to take that drop goal with just over 2 minutes remaining away in Dublin to give Munster the lead. They see the game out and they're heading to Cape Town for the final. Fair play to him, because it was a brilliant drop goal and he stepped up and took it. I think from what is really interesting in this game is the Leinster perspective and the fallout from this. And it's almost a little bit too early to tell, because I think Leinster's season ultimately is going to come down to that one game against La Rochelle now for the Champions Cup. They win the Champions Cup, they probably look back and say, disappointing to not win the URC for the second year, for another year. But we got our hands back on the Champions Cup. But it does mean that their season is riding hugely on that game, and I'll get onto that in a moment. But how much, Leinster fans, this is one for you, how much responsibility does Leo Cullen need to take for this? I looked at the Leinster team sheet, and the strength in depth in their team is such that it still looked like a good side. I wasn't hugely concerned for them. They still had a lot of pretty serious operators in there, but they did rotate that team. I think without question that team had an eye on the Champions Cup final. Did they underestimate Munster? Did they get complacent? The fact that they were at home, and despite all that, you've still got to give Munster credit, because I wouldn't have picked them to win this game. So it's not to take anything away from Munster, but I think from a Leinster point of view, I'm quite interested for you guys to get in touch down below and just let me know how you see that. Can you understand the team selection? Is the Champions Cup that much more important that you try and give your side a rest, a couple of weeks rest heading into that game? Or was it a massive slip up on this occasion? I think ultimately it was a bit of a slip up really from Leo Cullen, and for another year them not win this competition, not be in the final of this competition, yeah, I think that's a little bit of a problem really. I've seen a few fans in various comment sections and things pointing at Frank Murphy. Is that just being bitter fans, not being able to lose particularly well? Was the decision making unfair in any way? From what I've seen of the game, I didn't think there was anything too controversial. I know Leinster had the try ruled out, but I think it was tight, but probably was a knock on in the build up. So again, something that you can let me know down below. But what this does do is put huge pressure on Leinster for that Champions Cup final, I think, because their season now comes down to that. They could face 2 years in a row with no silverware. And for a side as talented as Leinster, that is a failure. That is a massive failure if that is to happen. And it is if, buts and maybes. I appreciate that. We'll have to wait and see what happens against La Rochelle. But you look at that Leinster team and they should be picking up more silverware. If they were to get nothing, they should have picked up more than that over the last few years. So that makes the Champions Cup final, I think it just adds another element to it and makes it very, very interesting indeed. The final point I'll say about this game is, despite the result, does this weekend still not just highlight what a great place Irish rugby is in? In that I thought Connacht did a pretty good job going to South Africa, and I know the scoreline in the end was pretty in favour of the Stormers, but they made a pretty good fist of it. Connacht, who have always kind of been the least well-resourced of the Irish provinces, they've had a really good season. Munster now as well, who haven't been anywhere near their best in terms of their historical best, and when they were winning Champions Cups and they were the best Irish team, they haven't been near that level for quite a long time, but they're still able to go to Dublin against Leinster, against their big rivals, and get the victory and send themselves through to a chance of winning silverware at the end of this year. All of those Irish teams have been in a great place. I know Ulster have been quite disappointing, haven't they, from what they would have expected, but generally Irish rugby in a great place. So the final thing really that I want to touch on is just a quick look ahead to the final. I'll try and do maybe a longer video on this once we get closer to it in a few weeks. Can Munster go to Cape Town and win? It's a tough order. It's a tough task to make that trip and play the Stormers away from home. I'm sure the crowd are going to be massively behind them. It's going to be tough. It will be really interesting to see how much of the Munster travelling support they get. I know over the years they've had some of the best away support as we've seen them travel around the Heineken Cup and all that sort of thing. They've got a couple of weeks, so they might be able to plan something, but that'll be interesting. The fans will be massively behind the Stormers though, but Munster are going to be full of confidence, because if they will be saying, if we can go to Dublin and beat Leinster, we can go to Cape Town and beat the Stormers. I also think the fact they've got 2 weeks to prepare makes a huge difference. Think about the Stormers in the Champions Cup, where they had 1 week to basically get themselves to Exeter in time for the quarter-final, it was, wasn't it? And they had to fly different sets of players arrived at different times. They basically didn't train throughout the week. The fact that Munster have 2 weeks now to prepare means that they can get that preparation a heck of a lot better, and it will, I think, make it a more competitive game. So I'm really pleased about that. I think it not necessarily evens the playing field, but it might make it a more interesting game. But yeah, we'll see what happens. But I think there's a few different things to consider there. And I just think it helps that Munster have those couple of weeks to prepare. I'll leave it there really in the video. Ultimately though, this result, really, really good for the URC. Let me know if you agree with me down below in the comments section. If you can like the video and subscribe to the channel as well, then I'd really, really appreciate it. But as always, guys, I'll see you in the next one.